On my 65th birthday, a mysterious gift arrived at my door. No card, no sender, just happy birthday, scrawled in blue ink. But I knew that handwriting instantly. It belonged to Nathan, the son I'd raised for 25 years. We hadn't spoken in 4. Inside the box, a limited edition bottle of whiskey 600 worth gleaming like liquid gold. Nathan didn't know, or maybe he did, that I'd quit drinking 4 years ago after my heart scare. Instead of cracking it open, I buckled it into my old Ford and drove down Main Street to give it to William Thompson, his father-in-law. Just a nice gesture, I thought, until that bottle nearly claimed 2 lives. And that was only the beginning of a twisted tale of family betrayal that would unravel everything I thought I knew about trust, loyalty, and the dark sides we hide from those we love. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I always love hearing your stories of family drama and revenge. Let me take you back to that morning. I set the bottle down on my farmhouse kitchen table with a soft thud that echoed in the quiet room. The morning light was streaming in through the old wooden blinds, cutting the space into sharp bands of gold and deep shadow, like nature itself was highlighting this unexpected arrival. The whiskey inside caught the light in a way that made it look alive, almost like it was holding a fire deep within its amber depths, flickering and dancing as if it had a secret to tell. The label was a deep, rich green with elegant gold lettering that screamed sophistication and expense, the kind of design that you know costs more than the liquid it contains, crafted to appeal to collectors and connoisseurs alike. I couldn't help but run my thumb over the wax seal on the cork, feeling its perfect smoothness under the rough ridges of my skin, worn from years of hard work on the farm. Whiskey used to be my thing, you see. Not in a reckless, sloppy way that leads to regrets, but in a slow, deliberate manner that marked the end of a long day. A single glass after fixing fence posts that had been battered by the wind, or cleaning out the gutters clogged with leaves from the old oak trees surrounding the property. Back when Margaret was still alive, she'd pour us both one after dinner on those lazy Sunday evenings. We'd sit out on the porch swing, the one I built with my own hands from reclaimed wood, and let the crickets fill the silence with their symphony, the stars overhead twinkling like distant memories. That was our ritual, a quiet moment of connection in a world that often felt too busy and chaotic. But that all changed 4 years ago, when the heart attack struck like a thief in the night, stealing away choices I didn't even know were precious. I haven't touched a drop since then, doctor's orders strict and non-negotiable. The long list of things I couldn't eat or drink anymore if I wanted to see 70 or beyond was laid out in that sterile hospital room at General Hospital, with Nathan right there beside me. He didn't say much, just stared down at his phone, his thumbs moving furiously across the screen, as if the digital world held more importance than the real one unfolding before him. I told myself he was just trying to distract himself from the fear, the uncertainty. But now, looking back, I'm not so sure. Maybe there was something else brewing beneath that indifferent exterior, something darker that I couldn't see at the time. We hadn't had one of those blowout fights you see in the movies, the kind where voices raise to shouting and someone storms out slamming the door so hard it rattles the windows. No, our estrangement was quieter, more insidious. It just stopped. First, he skipped a Sunday dinner here and there, making excuses about work or other commitments. Then he didn't show up for Thanksgiving, the table feeling emptier without his presence. By the second Christmas without him, I realized we weren't talking at all, the phone calls dwindling to nothing, the visits non-existent. Silence has a way of becoming its own habit, a comfortable numbness that settles in like dust on unused furniture. So to see his handwriting again after all this time, it pulled something tight in my chest, a tension that wasn't joy, not even relief, but unnamed weight. It was like a ghost from the past had suddenly materialized, bringing with it questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. The envelope taped to the side of the package was plain white, unassuming, like it was trying not to draw attention to itself. Inside was a single card with those two words, Happy Birthday, written in that same blue ink. No dad, no signature at the bottom. Just the phrase standing there alone like it was afraid to say more to commit to any deeper sentiment. I didn't open the bottle, didn't even entertain the thought for a moment. The temptation wasn't there anymore. The heart condition had seen to that. Instead, I slid it to the far side of the table and turned back to my coffee, which had gone cold in the mug, the steam long dissipated into the air. The clock over the stove ticked in a steady, deliberate rhythm that seemed to amplify the emptiness of the house each second, echoing like a reminder of how alone I truly was in that moment. That's when William Thompson's face came to mind, unbidden but welcome. William is the kind of man who's never shown up empty-handed or without a set of tools rattling in the bed of his truck. He's reliable, the sort who doesn't wait to be asked for help. He just sees the need and steps in. 2 summers ago, after a fierce storm ripped half the shingles off my roof, leaving it exposed to the elements, he was up on a ladder by 8 a.m., hammer in hand, patching things up before I'd even brewed my first cup of coffee. Rain was still dripping from the eaves, but there he was, working away, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. If anyone deserved something nice like this whiskey, it was him. And since I couldn't drink it myself, the idea of it gathering dust on my shelf felt wrong, wasteful. William would open it on a special occasion, share it with friends over stories and laughter, give it a life beyond just sitting there. That felt better than letting it fade behind glass in some display case, forgotten and unused. By mid-afternoon, the bottle was securely buckled into the passenger seat of my old Ford truck. I don't know why I did that. Maybe it was just habit from years of transporting fragile farm equipment. But the thought of it tumbling around on the curves of the road made me uneasy, like I was protecting something valuable without knowing why. The sun was tilting west, casting everything in that warm amber light you only get in late October, when the leaves are turning and the air carries a crisp edge. The fields along Main Street were starting to brown, the corn stalks cut down to stubble after the harvest, the earth resting before the winter freeze. The air smelled faintly of smoke, from someone's distant burn pile mixing with the scent of damp soil and falling leaves, a familiar Midwest aroma that always grounded me. William's place sits on a gentle rise at the edge of town. A sturdy wood-sided house with a wraparound porch that looks like it stepped out of a postcard from simpler times. The gravel driveway crunched under my tires as I pulled up and killed the engine, the sudden silence broken only by the wind rustling through the trees. He opened the door before I could even knock, dressed in his usual red flannel shirt and faded jeans, with sawdust still clinging to his boots from whatever project he'd been working on in his workshop. His eyes went straight to the bottle in my hands, curiosity lighting up his weathered face. "John, what's this?" he asked, stepping forward with that easy smile of his. "From Nathan," I said, offering it to him like it was no big deal. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Nathan sent you this?" "Yeah. Figured you might enjoy it more than I would, what with my heart and all." He took it carefully, almost reverently, turning it in his hands to read the label, appreciating the craftsmanship. "This is something special, John. This is the kind of bottle you put away for a special night, then decide to make tonight that night." I nodded, meaning it when I said, "I think you should. Thank you for everything." He grinned, that genuine, warm expression that always made me feel like family, even though we weren't blood. "I think I will. Thanks, old friend." It felt good to hand it off, to see it go to someone who would truly appreciate it, who would give it the story it deserved. I got back in the truck, the late light slanting across the dashboard, casting long shadows that danced as I drove. But on the way home, my mind kept circling back to the bottle, not in a thirsty way, not craving the burn of the liquid, but in a curious, nagging manner that I couldn't quite shake. Nathan had never been one to spend that kind of money without a clear reason behind it. Hell, half the time when he was younger, living under my roof, and learning the ropes of the farm, he'd borrow cash from me for gas or some other necessity, and conveniently forget to pay it back, always with a sheepish grin and a promise for next time. So why now? Why send a gift that he knew full well I couldn't use? The thought itched at the back of my mind like a splinter under the skin as I pulled into my driveway, the familiar sight of the farmhouse welcoming me home. I tried to shut it down, to tell myself that not everything in life needs a deep reason or motive. But deep down, I didn't believe it. There was something off, something that didn't add up. That evening, I made a pot roast in the slow cooker, the house filling with the comforting smell of onions, caramelizing carrots, softening, and meat tenderizing, the kind of meal that's always better when shared with loved ones around the table, laughing and talking about the day's events. But I ate it alone, the portions too large for one, the silence broken only by the ticking of the wall clock as it inched its way toward 9 o'clock. I was washing the last plate suds bubbling in the sink when the phone rang, not my cell, but the old landline that hardly ever gets used these days, its ring echoing through the empty rooms like a relic from another era. "Hello? Dad?" Nathan's voice came through smooth and casual, as if no time had passed, as if the 4 years of silence were just a minor hiccup. I leaned against the counter for support, the cool edge pressing into my back. "Nathan, happy birthday," he said, but there was a beat too late, making it sound unnatural, forced. "You got my gift." "I did." "Well, what'd you think?" "It's a nice bottle." "Did you try it yet?" His tone shifted just slightly, the edges sharpening like a knife being honed. "No, I passed it along to William. Thought he'd get more use out of it." There was silence on the line, not a dropout or static interference, but a long, heavy pause that hung in the air like a storm cloud. "You gave it to William." His voice had cooled, lost its casual warmth. There was a sound like an exhale, slow and measured, controlled. Then the line went dead, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. I stared at the receiver for a moment, my mind racing, before setting it back in its cradle with a click. The clock kept ticking, oblivious to the tension. My gut felt unsettled, twisted not from the pot roast, which had been perfectly cooked, but from something less tangible, more insidious. The way he'd asked about the whiskey, the insistence in his voice, it mattered in a way it shouldn't have, like there was more at stake than just a birthday gift. I turned off the kitchen light, plunging the room into darkness, and headed to bed. But sleep came slowly that night. When I did finally drift off, it was light and restless, the kind of slumber that leaves you more tired when you wake, haunted by dreams you can't quite remember but feel in your bones. The next morning, I tried to shake it off, to push the unease to the back of my mind. I poured a fresh cup of coffee, strong and black, and sat down with the local paper, scanning the headlines about town events and weather forecasts. But the phone rang again around midday, interrupting my routine. The caller ID flashed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local, so I answered. "Mr. Harper." The voice on the other end was Susan Thompson Williams' wife, and it was tight with worry, strained like a wire about to snap. "Yes, this is John. I thought you should know Williams in General Hospital. He collapsed this morning. They think it might be some kind of poisoning." The coffee in my hand went cold instantly, the mug suddenly heavy. "Poisoning?" My voice came out flatter than I intended. "He was fine last night," she said, her words rushing out. "We had a drink with dinner, just one glass, and this morning he could barely stand. The doctors are running tests trying to figure it out." I didn't speak right away, my eyes drifting to the counter, to the empty spot where the whiskey had sat less than 24 hours ago, mocking me with its absence. "Did he eat anything unusual?" she asked, desperation creeping in. My mouth felt dry like cotton. "No, but I gave him a bottle yesterday, whiskey from Nathan." There was a pause on her end, and in the background, I could hear the familiar noises of the hospital monitors beeping steadily, a cart squeaking down the hallway, muffled voices of nurses and doctors. "I'll tell the doctors," she said finally, her voice resolute. "If you think of anything else, anything at all, call me." I promised I would then hung up, the click of the phone echoing in the silent house. I stood there in the kitchen for what felt like an eternity, the October light turning pale and flat through the windows. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally did, it was to walk over to the trash bin. Something white caught my eye near the bottom, a small plastic vial, the kind that vitamins come in but with no label. Just a faint dusting of powder clinging to the inside. I didn't remember throwing it away. I picked it up, the cap screwed on tight. Then I went to the fridge. On the middle shelf behind the milk sat a mason jar with about half a cup of whiskey in it, left over from when I'd poured William a taste before handing over the bottle. I hadn't even remembered keeping it until that moment. My hand shook as I took it out and set it on the counter next to the vial. Mike and I had worked the fields together 35 years ago, and now he ran a small veterinary lab on the edge of town. He owed me a favor from a few winters back when I'd pulled his truck out of a ditch. I called him. Mike, I need you to test something for me quietly. What is it, whiskey and maybe something else? He didn't ask more questions, just told me to meet him after closing. That evening, I drove out to his lab, the mason jar wrapped in a paper bag on the seat beside me. Mike met me in the parking lot, his lab coat thrown over a sweatshirt, the faint smell of disinfectant in the air. This is the kind of thing I'm gonna regret, he said. Just tell me what's in it, I replied. He nodded, took the bag, and disappeared inside. I sat in the truck with the engine running, watching the light fade from the sky. The radio was off. My thoughts looped the handwriting, the bottle, Nathan's voice when I told him I'd given it to William, that long, heavy pause. My stomach tightened. Mike called the next day just after lunch. John, you're not gonna like this. There's something in the whiskey white snake root. In the right dose, it'll stop a man's heart. I closed my eyes. The phone felt heavy. You said William drank this? Yes. You didn't? No. He let out a slow breath. Then you might have just dodged a bullet. And that's where the first part of this story ends, not with answers, but with a question that would take me places I never thought I'd have to go. Because the moment I hung up, I knew Nathan had sent me more than a gift. He'd sent me a message. I used to think there was no sound worse than the phone ringing in the middle of the night. Turns out there is. It's the phone ringing when you already know, deep down, the news will be bad. When Mike hung up after telling me the whiskey had white snake root in it, the world around me went very still, like the house was holding its breath. I didn't sit with it. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair, slid my truck keys off the hook by the door, and headed for General Hospital. The drive into town was all stoplights and empty intersections, the kind of late morning where the sun looks bright but gives no warmth. I parked in the far corner of the lot, out of habit, and walked fast, one hand in my pocket, the other pressed to my ribs, like I could steady whatever was shifting inside me. Hospitals all smell the same, something sterile, cut with burnt coffee, and the light is always too white. A volunteer pointed me to William's room. He didn't look like the man who climbed my roof without being asked. He looked lighter, washed out, his skin a shade paler than the pillow under his head. The monitors at his bedside hummed and blinked in time with a slow, stubborn heartbeat. Susan was in a plastic chair pulled as close as it could get. She had that look I've seen 100 times, the one people wear when they're waiting on something that refuses to hurry up and be over. John, she said, getting up. Thank you for coming. How is he? They're trying to stabilize his heart rhythm. Her hands were clasped together at her chest, not praying, but as if holding air tight would keep it from leaking out of her. They said they found signs of a plant toxin. They're running more tests. I stepped closer to the bed. William's mouth was parted, a line of breath in a line of breath out. His hair, always combed back neatly, had fallen toward his forehead in a way that made him look younger and more fragile at the same time. I didn't belong here, as family, not on paper, but blood isn't the only measure of closeness. Sometimes it's the person who shows up with a hammer and a smile before you've had time to worry that your roof might leak. Did he eat anything unusual last night? I asked. Or drink anything he doesn't normally? We both had one glass with dinner. She looked at me, the question already there. The bottle you brought. He said it was the nicest whiskey he'd ever tasted. He wanted to save the rest for something special. My jaw set without me telling it to. I need you to tell the doctors exactly that, I said. Tell them it was new unopened, and tell them I can get them a small sample from the same bottle. She reached out like she might take my hand, then changed her mind and gripped the rail instead. John, what is this? Do you think? I don't know what I think, I said, which was only half a lie, but I'm going to find out. The doctor came in, a man in his 50s, with a face that had learned not to react. He explained in quiet, practiced tones about rhythms and enzymes and observation. He didn't say what he didn't know, and he didn't know a lot yet. When he left, Susan sat back down, and I promised to call her as soon as I had anything she could use. She nodded, but the nod had no weight. It was something to do with her head because her hands were already committed to staying clenched. I walked out with my jaw still tight and my hands jammed into my jacket pockets. The automatic doors slid open and hit me with air that felt wrong for October, bright as a postcard and cold as a church. In the truck, I didn't start the engine right away. I sat there with the key halfway turned and looked at my reflection in the rear view. I looked like a man who had nothing left to break that hadn't already been cracked once. White snake root, I said aloud, testing the words in the air like a carpenter checking a board for warp. They sounded mean. They sounded deliberate. On the way home, the road unspooled like a tape you've listened to too many times. I turned onto my street and noticed nothing else. The mailboxes, the dog at the corner house, the man raking leaves with his son. I parked, locked the truck without thinking, and went straight to the refrigerator. The mason jar with the splash of whiskey was still there on the center shelf, hidden behind the milk. I held it up to the light and watched the liquid curl against the glass when I tilted it. You wouldn't know by looking. You never do. All the worst things come dressed like something harmless. I put the jar down next to the sink and crossed to the trash. I'd tossed that little white vial in yesterday. I hadn't taken the bag out. I'm an old man living alone, and my trash doesn't fill as fast as it used to. I lifted the lid, looked, and felt my body go still. The bag had been lifted and put back the wrong way around, and the vial was gone. I looked at the door. The deadbolt was set like I'd left it last night. The windows were down and latched. I keep no spare keys under rocks or mats. I keep no spare keys anywhere a reasonable fool might imagine. Still, someone had been here. I could feel it, like the way you know a room has been rearranged even if you can't name what moved. I took a long breath in through my nose and let it out slowly. Not panic. Panic is loud and stupid. I needed something quiet and useful. I picked up the phone and called Mike. It's gone, I said when he answered. What is... The little vial I told you about. Someone took it out of my trash. I didn't move it. I know what my own hands have done in my own house. He didn't tell me I might be mistaken. Mike understands the cost of ignoring what your gut already knows. You need to get law enforcement looped in, he said. I can document what's in the whiskey, but that vial would have been clean proof of handling. I know, I said. I will. And John. Yeah. Don't let whoever did this think you're sleeping on it. I'm not, I said and ended the call. I made coffee I didn't want and sat at the table with a legal pad. The act of writing steadies me. I drew a line down the center of the page and labeled the left side, what I know, and the right side, what I can prove. Under what I know, I wrote Nathan sent the bottle. Nathan asked if I'd tried it. Nathan changed tone when I said I gave it to William. The whiskey Mike tested has white snake root. The vial is missing. Under what I can prove, I wrote Mike's test. The leftover sample is in the jar. The call from Nathan last night, if my memory holds. Then I stared at the two columns and wanted to draw a bridge between them. Bridges don't appear because you want them to. You have to build them. I took the small, digital voice recorder out of the desk drawer. It's old, a little scuffed at the corners, a cheap thing that has done its job without ever getting thanked for it. I checked the battery half full. I slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket, right where the weight of it would feel like a hand on my chest, reminding me to breathe. It was just past noon by the time I pulled into Nathan's development. His house sat in a row of other houses that looked like variations of the same idea: neutral siding, brass numbers on porch light that came on by itself when the sun started to quit. His truck was in the driveway, clean, newer than mine by a decade. I walked up the path and knocked. He opened the door with a face that flipped twice before landing surprise, then calculation, then something he thought looked like warmth. "Dad," he said, like he'd been expecting me, and also like he had no idea what I could want. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" I asked, and stepped inside without waiting. The place smelled like lemon and nothing else. He keeps it neat, always has everything at right angles, nothing left out of place, except for the kind of books you buy to display, something about them. "I heard about William," he said, closing the door. "Scary. Emily's with him now. The doctors think it might be a virus." "Is that what they think?" I kept my tone flat. If I pushed, he'd set his heels. If I showed softness, he'd use it. "That's what she said," he replied. "That's what they're saying." I took it to the kitchen. There on the counter sat 3 bottles, 2 bourbon, 1 rye, lined up like soldiers. None of them was the brand I'd given him. None of them opened. I looked back at him. He was watching me watch his things, and he smiled like someone who believes the way his smile looks is the way it lands. "Did you try the bottle you sent me?" I asked. He laughed softly. "The whole point was for you to enjoy it. For your birthday." "I don't drink anymore." "People change," he said with a shrug that made me feel like I was of no particular interest. I moved 1 step closer to the counter and ran a finger along the rim of the empty glass sitting by the sink like a man might when he's killing time while his host makes coffee. "William liked it," I said. "Said his favorite pour was the one from the middle shelf, the single malt." He blinked just once slower than a reflex. "Yeah. Funny thing," I said, and I could feel the recorder in my pocket steady as a heartbeat. "I never told you where it was stored." For the smallest fraction of a second, he went still the way an animal does when it hears a twig snap. Then his mouth pulled up on one side, and he shook his head with a little practiced laugh. "You must have. You get chatty when you're sentimental." "I didn't," I said, and held his eyes until he had to pick whether to look away or stare me down. He chose a third option. He reached for a dish towel and started drying a glass that had already been dried. "Dad," he said, looking at the glass instead of me. "You always overthink. You always find something to fix, even when no one asked for it." "You sent me a $600 bottle I can't drink," I said. "I'm trying to fix that." He put the glass down and spread his hands like a man with nothing to hide. "Then maybe don't. Maybe give me the benefit of the doubt for once." His voice could pass for reasonable if you hadn't been listening to it for 45 years. My son has a way of sounding true when he is rehearsed. That pause from last night sat between us like a third person in the room, sitting on the counter and swinging its legs. "I'm going to ask you a question," I said, "and I'm going to let the silence after it tell me the answer. He gave me a look like we were playing chess and I'd announced my next move aloud. Okay. Did you tamper with that whiskey? Silence. It's a living thing when you use it right. The fridge hummed. The clock on the microwave clicked from 12:09 to 12:10. A car passed outside slow enough that we both heard the tires over the pavement. He didn't look away. He also didn't speak. Goodbye, Nathan, I said, because sometimes leaving is the only sentence that counts. He said my name as I turned Dad in that tone where the word is both a hook and a warning. I stopped, but I didn't turn back. You keep accusing me of things you'll push me away, he said. I'm not accusing. I told the door. I'm collecting. Outside, the air was sharp and a little metallic. I sat in the truck and pressed my thumb against the recorder's stop button. The red light blinked off. I set it on the seat beside me and stared at it like it was a witness I might have to call later. My hands were steady. My head was not. I didn't drive home. Not yet. I parked at the far edge of the supermarket lot where no one would bother me and made a call I had been putting off since the moment Mike said White Snake Route. Detective Lopez, a voice said after 2 rings. Detective, my name is John Harper. I believe I may have information about a poisoning. I have a sample of the substance and an audio recording that might interest you. He didn't ask me to explain myself right there on the phone. Men who know their work don't demand the whole truth in the first breath. Can you come in this afternoon? He asked. Yes, I said. I can. He gave me a time and an office number tucked into the back hallway of the station. When I hung up, I sat with my hands on the wheel and looked straight ahead. The supermarket's automatic doors kept opening for no one and closing for no one else. People came and went, carrying paper bags full of apples and milk and things that would make their houses smell like dinners. I remember, back at the house, I stopped at the mailbox because sometimes you need to do something ordinary to keep the other things from swallowing you whole. Flyers, a bill, a grocery ad, and a postcard from a car dealership that thinks I can be bought with 0% financing. Inside, I put the mason jar into a Ziploc, sealed it like I knew what I was doing, and slid it into an old cigar tin I'd kept for nails. The recorder went into the same tin. I put the tin in a paper bag with handles. I put that bag into another bag because once you've had one thing disappear from your trash, double layers start to feel less like paranoia and more like common sense. I called Susan. She answered on the second ring, voice small. John, I'm going to the police, I said. I have a sample and something else. William's resting, she said. They've got him on a monitor. He keeps waking up and asking what day it is. I tell him, and he nods like he's trying to decide if he believes me. I'll call you after I meet with the detective, I said. Tell him I'll stop by after if he wants to see an old face that isn't asking him to be strong. She laughed a single breathless sound. He likes being asked to be strong, she said. But he likes you more. I locked up, checked the back door, checked the window latches again, and walked out to the truck. The paper bag sat on the passenger seat like a person. I buckled it in because habit is comfort when sense is scarce. On the way to the station, I turned the radio on without listening. People sang about things that sounded simple. It made me angry, and then it made me tired, and then it made me nothing. The station was cooler than the hospital somehow, and smelled better. Lopez met me in a small office with a window that looked at a brick wall. He was younger than me by a lot, but older than a rookie with sharp eyes, a tie that had been straightened more than once today. He offered me water. I said yes because my mouth was dry and because people notice when you refuse everything they offer. He waited until I took a sip before he asked his first question. Tell me about the whiskey. So I did. I gave him the dates, the words Nathan used, and the pause that didn't feel like surprise. I didn't give him my theories. I gave him the index cards of the facts and let him stack them however he wanted. Then I put the paper bag on his desk and took the tin out and opened it and set the mason jar and the recorder on his blotter, like tools at the start of a job. He didn't touch them yet. He asked questions that sounded like small ones, but weren't. Who else has keys to your house? When did you last check your trash? Did you mention the vial to anyone besides Mike? Then he lifted the recorder and weighed it in his hand the way a man does when he's thinking about how heavy a word might be if you had to carry it. You understand, he said. This doesn't become a case because you and I both have a feeling. It becomes a case when what you've handed me can survive other people looking at it. I do, I said. I want other people to look at it. He nodded. We'll send the liquid to the state lab. We'll make a copy of your audio. If there's cause, we'll move. If there isn't, we'll tell you exactly why we can't. You okay with that? I am, I said, and meant it. I'm not in the business of wanting the wrong man punished. I'm in the business of wanting the right truth told. When I stood to leave, he said my name like he was picking it up to see how it felt. Mr. Harper. Yes. Don't speak to your son again until I tell you to. If he reaches out, note the time and what he says, and keep your answers shorter than his questions. I nodded, surprised by the feeling that someone else was finally willing to carry a corner of the weight I'd been holding. Outside, the afternoon had gone a dull gray kind of bright, the kind that hurts your eyes more than it lights your way. I drove to the hospital. Susan was in the same chair, and the same machines were singing their quiet electronic lullaby. William looked more like himself by degrees. His skin had a little color back, and his mouth was less tense around the breath that came and went. I put my hand on the rail, and his eyes cracked open. You look like hell, he whispered. You should see yourself, I said, and he smiled with just the left side of his mouth, the way men do when smiling takes too much of the rest of their face. I heard you're making friends with the police, he said. I'm trying to make sure they're on our side when they show up, I said. He closed his eyes again, nodded once, and drifted. I stood there longer than I needed to, listening to the machine keep him honest about his heartbeat. Susan whispered things that don't belong to anyone but them. I stepped out into the hall. The next few days were a whirlwind of waiting and building evidence. Lopez kept me updated in short calls. They had the lab results confirming the toxin the audio analyzed for tone and content. Then came the warrant for Nathan's house. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I parked across the street anyway, watching from my truck as the officers approached. Nathan's place was on a corner lot, the kind of suburban box with vinyl siding and a lawn too perfect to be natural. 2 officers knocked a long pause. Then the door opened, and there he was, my son, wearing a faded baseball t-shirt and a face I barely recognized. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the stiff way he crossed his arms, the half-step back, when Lopez held up the paper. The officers entered, and Nathan followed jaw tight. I stayed in the truck, engine off, hands on the wheel. The minutes stretched. I imagined the sound of drawers opening, boxes sliding across shelves, the rustle of paper. I'd been in enough searches during my younger days to know the rhythm: quick sweep, then slow sift. My phone buzzed. A text from Lopez. Found something. We'll update. Found. That something came into view 20 minutes later, when an officer carried a plastic evidence bag to the patrol car. Even from where I sat, I could see the label, same brand, same style as the whiskey Nathan had sent me. Only this one was half empty. I didn't move, didn't breathe, almost because finding that bottle wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the end. At 9:05, Lopez stepped outside, scanned the street, and spotted my truck. He walked over, leaned down to the open window. You shouldn't be here, he said. Too late for that. What did you find? A couple more bottles from the same batch. One open, one sealed. We'll get them tested, but there's residue in the open one, white powder faint, same as what Mike found. I swallowed hard. That's enough. It's enough to push this forward. But John, he hesitated. We also found a notebook handwritten coded in parts. Mike might be able to help us with it, but from what I skimmed, it reads like dosage notes trials. The word trials landed heavily. So, William wasn't the first. Lopez didn't answer. He didn't have to. I sat back, eyes on the house. Inside somewhere was the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager I'd driven to his first job, the young man I'd stood beside when he married Emily. And now there was a man who kept dosage notes, a man who could have been the reason William nearly died. Lopez's radio crackled. He straightened. They're bringing him out. You sure you want to see this? I've already seen enough, I said, but I didn't drive away. The front door opened. Nathan stepped out, flanked by 2 officers. His wrists were cuffed in front of him, his chin high, eyes cold. He scanned the street until they landed on me. Our eyes locked. No words, no nod. Just that stare, the kind you give someone you once knew but no longer claim. They put him in the back of the cruiser. I stayed put until the car pulled away, the reflection of the morning sun catching on the glass. Lopez came back over. He's going downtown. We'll book him, start the interview. He'll probably lawyer up. I know, I said. What about the notebook? I'll get it copied before it goes into full evidence. If you're up for it, you can look, see if any of the dates match something you remember. That afternoon at the station, Lopez laid the notebook on the table between us. The handwriting was Nathan's unmistakable loops on the G, the way he pressed hard enough to dent the page. Some entries were dated with numbers beside them. Others were symbols, a triangle, a slash, an asterisk. Mike joined us via speakerphone, his voice crackling through the line. That triangle, that's shorthand for half dose in some veterinary circles, and the asterisk usually means observe for delayed effect. I flipped to a page dated 6 months ago. Next to the date was a single word, test, then a triangle, then WT. My stomach turned. W.T. William Thompson. Lopez wrote it down. So he's been thinking about this for months. 2 pages later, I saw another set of initials, J.H., my own. Next to it, no triangle, no half dose, just a solid number bigger than the rest. Mike's voice was quiet. That's a lethal dose, John. For a moment, the room tilted. I steadied myself with a hand on the table. So William wasn't the only target? No, Lopez said. You were the other. I drove home in silence. The notebook's images burned into my mind. Every meal, every drink I'd had in the last year replayed in my head, looking for moments he could have acted. I thought of that whiskey bottle sitting in my cabinet for days before I gave it to William. I thought about what would have happened if I decided to drink just 1 glass for old time's sake. By evening, the local news had it. Local man arrested in alleged poisoning attempt. They didn't use Nathan's name yet, but the description was enough for anyone who knew us to fill in the blanks. Susan called. The neighbors are talking. William's furious, says if Nathan shows his face at the house again, he'll... She trailed off. You okay? Not really, but I'm not dead. That's something. That night, I opened the fireproof box again, added a new card, JH, initials in notebook, lethal dose, slid it in next to the others. The box was getting full. I sat on the porch, the air heavy with summer heat, thinking about the difference between justice and closure. Justice can come in a courtroom. Closure, that's trickier. 2 days later, Lopez called early. John is lawyers angling for a deal. Claims Nathan didn't know the whiskey was tainted, that he bought it from a friend and didn't check it. But with the notebook, that's a hard sell. What happens if he pleads out? Lighter sentence, maybe no trial, but it's still prison time. Question is, do you want to see him in court? I looked out at the street, the same one Nathan had learned to ride his bike on, and thought about the weight of my answer. They say every man has a line he won't cross. I used to think mine was family. No matter what Nathan did, I told myself I'd never push him so far he couldn't find his way back. But that was before the whiskey, before William, in a hospital bed, before I found my initials in that notebook next to a number that meant you don't wake up. Now the line felt like a chalk mark in the rain, fading fast. The morning after Lopez called, I didn't get out of bed right away. The ceiling fan ticked slowly overhead, and my mind kept circling the same thought. If I say yes to a trial, I'll be the man who put his son in prison for a long, long time. If I say no, I'll be the man who let him walk after trying to kill me. Either way, there's no going back. By 9 a.m., I was at the station. Lopez was in the interview room leaning over a stack of papers. Across from him sat Nathan's lawyer, Harlan, a wiry man with silver hair and an expression like he'd already won. Nathan wasn't there. They'd kept him in holding. Lopez waved me in. "John, this is Mr. Harlan." Harlan stood, shook my hand, his grip dry, calculated. "Mr. Harper, I appreciate you coming in. I think we can resolve this in a way that spares everyone the unpleasantness of a trial." I sat. "You mean in a way that spares Nathan?" His smile didn't flinch. "He's prepared to admit to mishandling the bottle carelessness, not malice. In exchange, reduced charges, no attempted murder. He'd serve some time, but not much." "And the notebook?" I asked. "An exercise in paranoia," Harlan said smoothly. "Our position is that it's fiction scribbles, nothing more." I looked at Lopez. He didn't say a word, but his jaw tightened. I leaned back. "Do you know what it's like to read your initials next to a lethal dose, Mr. Harlan? To see that written by the kid you taught to fish, the one you drove across the state so he could try out for his first baseball team." For the first time, Harlan's gaze dropped. "We're talking about avoiding a public spectacle, Mr. Harper." I let the silence stretch. The ticking wall clock felt louder. Finally, I said, "I'll think about it," and I walked out. In the hallway, Lopez caught up. "You don't have to decide today, but John, if you go for trial, we've got enough to make it stick. The DA's ready to file the full charges." "What would you do?" I asked. Lopez sighed. "I don't have skin in your game, but if it were me, I'd make sure the next person he hands a drink to doesn't end up in the ground." That night, my phone rang. It was William Thompson. His voice was still weak but steady. "John, I heard about the deal they're offering him. Word travels fast. You can't take it." "William, no. Listen to me. If you do, he'll think he can come back from anything. Next time, it won't be whiskey. It'll be something no one catches in time. Maybe it'll be you. Maybe it'll be someone else he's decided doesn't deserve to be here." I closed my eyes. The truth in his voice was like gravel rough, but solid. The next morning, I drove to Mike's place. He was in his workshop tinkering with a busted outboard motor. "John," he said, "you look like a man deciding whether to pull a trigger." "Something like that." We sat on overturned buckets, the smell of oil thick in the air. I told him about the plea deal. He wiped his hands on a rag. "You already know what you're going to do. You just want me to make you feel better about it." "Maybe." Mike tossed the rag onto the workbench. "John, a man who keeps dosage notes, isn't careless. He's committed. You go easy now. You might as well hand him the pen and paper for his next list." That afternoon, I drove past Nathan's house. The blinds were shut, the driveway empty. I thought about the garage, the one where he'd fixed up an old Ford when he was 16, grease on his hands, a grin on his face when the engine finally turned over. Back then, I thought it meant he could build something lasting. Now I wondered if it was just the first sign he could take things apart. At home, I opened the fireproof box again. The cards were all there. William's name, the lab results, the notebook page with JH. I laid them out like a hand of bad poker. Then I imagined shoving them back in and locking the box away, pretending they didn't matter. But the truth was, they mattered more than anything. The decision came like a door clicking shut. I called Lopez. "Tell the DA I'll testify. Full charges." He didn't say "good man" or "you're doing the right thing." He just said "understood," and that was enough. 3 days later, the hearing was set. Pretrial motions, evidence lists, witness prep. Harlan filed objections to half of it, but the judge overruled most. When they brought Nathan into the courtroom for the first time, he scanned the room and found me. His eyes didn't soften. If anything, they sharpened, like I just made his list again. I held his gaze because maybe I had. They call it a courtroom, but to me it felt like a minefield. Every word, every glance could blow up in your face. I'd walked in thinking the truth would stand on its own. Then I saw the way Nathan's lawyer was smiling at me, like he already knew where I was going to step and how hard I was going to fall. The day of the evidentiary hearing, the benches were half full, but the air felt heavier than a packed church in August. I sat behind Lopez and the DA, my hands folded in my lap, pretending they weren't sweating. Nathan came in wearing county orange wrists cuffed. He didn't look at me at first. Then he did just long enough to let the corners of his mouth twitch, not into a smile, but into something colder. I reminded myself why I was here. William's hospital bed, the lab report, that damn notebook. The judge called us to order. Lopez took the stand first, crisp and professional, walking the court through how the bottle had been received, tested, and confirmed as poisoned. Harlan objected twice, claiming lack of chain of custody, but the judge overruled both. Then came my turn. The bailiff swore me in. I sat down the microphone close enough that I could hear my breathing. The DA started with soft pitches, my name, my age, where I lived, and my relation to the defendant. "Yes, Nathan is my son," I said, and it sounded strange in the open air, like it belonged to someone else's life. The DA guided me to the day of the gift. I told it straight, the package, the handwriting, the decision to give it to William, how William ended up in the hospital, how Mike tested the bottle. I kept my tone even, like Lopez told me, stick to the facts. Let the evidence do the work. Then Harlan stood. "Mr. Harper?" he began, voice smooth as polished wood. "You claim you recognize my client's handwriting on the note." "I don't claim. I know." "But you haven't seen that handwriting in over 4 years, correct?" "That's correct." "Is it possible then that you're mistaken?" "No." He leaned in one hand on the rail. "You're telling this court you're certain beyond any doubt that a man's life should be ruined because you think a note looks like your son's handwriting." I felt the first flare of heat in my chest. "I don't think. I know." Harlan stepped back almost casually. "Interesting, because we have here," he held up a paper, "a handwriting analysis from a certified examiner who says the note could not have been written by Nathan Harper." Murmurs rippled through the room. The judge banged her gavel. The DA objected, questioning the report's validity. The judge allowed it for the record, but my stomach dropped. Harlan smiled faintly. "And tell me, Mr. Harper, isn't it true that you and my client have had a strained relationship for years? That you sold his mother's farm without consulting him?" The DA objected again, irrelevant and inflammatory. "Sustained," the judge said, but the damage was done. The jury had heard it. When it was over, I stepped down, my legs heavier than they'd been in years. Lopez met me at the table. "They're trying to paint you as bitter, resentful," he said quietly. "It's all they've got. Don't let it stick." But I could feel it sticking already. Outside on the courthouse steps, William was waiting, leaning on his cane. "They're throwing dirt," he said. "Doesn't matter if it's true. They just need enough to cloud the water." I nodded. "They've got a handwriting report now." William's mouth twisted. "Paid for, most likely. I've seen those in business disputes. You can buy an opinion the way you buy a tie." That night, I sat on the porch, the crickets loud, the air smelling faintly of rain. I kept replaying Harlan's questions. Each one had been aimed at making me look like a bitter old man with a grudge, not a father trying to survive his own son's betrayal. I poured myself a glass of water, stared at it for a long time. 4 years without whiskey, and yet here I was, feeling like I'd swallowed something that burned just as bad. The next morning, Lopez called. "John, I've got something." We pulled text records from Nathan's phone. "There's a string of messages to a contact saved as WT the night before William got sick." "William Thompson?" "Not exactly. We traced the number. It's a burner phone bought 2 towns over. But the texts, John, they read like instructions, dosage timing, and here's the kicker, they match the compound Mike found in the whiskey." I felt the knot in my chest loosen just slightly. "Does the DA have it?" "They will by noon. This changes the game." 2 hours later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Harlan. "Mr. Harper," he said smoothly, "you should know your testimony today. It only made me more certain you're letting old wounds cloud your judgment. If you push this to trial, everything about your past with Nathan comes out. Everything. You ready for that?" It wasn't a threat in tone, but in content. It was sharp as a knife. I didn't answer right away. I just let the silence stretch until he finally hung up. That evening, I drove out to the local lake. The water was still reflecting the low orange sun. I thought about the farm, about Margaret's laughter on summer nights, about the boy Nathan used to be, and I thought about William pale in that hospital bed tubes in his arm. When I left the lake, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't stepping back. The truth wasn't just on trial. It was mine to carry all the way to the verdict. The morning of the trial, I didn't shave, not out of defiance, but because I wanted the jury to see the truth on my face. Every line carved by years of work loss and the kind of betrayal you don't come back from. I wasn't here to look polished. I was here to end something. And if that meant watching my son in shackles, so be it. The courtroom was already humming when I walked in. The DA sat at our table shuffling papers. Lopez gave me a nod from the back row, the kind that says, "We've got this, but it's going to hurt." Nathan was brought in still in that same muted orange jumpsuit. His eyes swept the room, stopping briefly on me. This time, there was no smirk, just something unreadable, like he was trying to decide whether I was even worth the effort of hating. The judge entered, the bailiff called for order, and suddenly, the trial was underway. The DA's opening statement was clean, sharp, and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a case about trust. Trust given and trust betrayed in a way most of us can hardly imagine. You will hear how the defendant Nathan Harper knowingly sent a gift laced with a deadly toxin to his father." I watched the jurors' eyes as the DA spoke. A few darted toward Nathan. Others kept their gaze locked on the DA. Nobody looked bored. Harlan's opening was smooth as oil. He painted me as estranged, resentful, unwilling to reconcile, and hinted at family disputes over property as a motive for me to fabricate the entire thing. I kept my jaw still, but inside, I could feel the old anger rise. The first witness was William Thompson. He walked slowly to the stand, leaning hard on his cane, but his voice was steady. I remember the taste bitter, not like any whiskey I'd had before he told the jury. Within an hour, I couldn't stand without help. I thought it was my heart giving out. Turns out, it was someone else's idea entirely. When Harlan cross-examined him, he tried to suggest William had mixed medications with alcohol and caused his condition. William's answer was, "Quiet, son. I've been on these meds for 10 years, never ended up in the hospital until that night." The jury liked that answer. I could see it. Then Lopez took the stand with the phone records, the text to the burner phone, the timestamps, the chemical dosage instructions all laid out. Harlan objected to their admissibility, citing privacy violations, but the judge overruled him. When the DA asked Lopez to read one of the messages aloud, the room went silent. "Make sure he gets it all in the first pour," Won't take much with his heart. Some jurors looked shocked. One woman in the front row pressed her lips together like she was holding back words. I felt my breath catch. Seeing the evidence in black and white was one thing. Hearing it out loud in that sterile courtroom was another. The DA called me next. I told the story again. Birthday's the bottle, giving it to William in the hospital. I tried not to linger on the personal, but it's hard to talk about your son trying to kill you without the edges showing. Harlan's cross-examination was harsher this time. Mr. Harper, are you aware that my client claims this was a gift purchased by his wife without his knowledge? I shook my head. No, and I don't believe it. You don't believe it because you don't want to believe it. You've built this entire case on assumptions. No, I cut in on evidence, the kind your client left all over that bottle. The judge told me to answer only when asked, but I'd already seen Harlan's jaw tighten. By the afternoon, both sides had rested their cases for the day. Tomorrow would be the closing arguments. I stepped outside into the cool air, but before I could take 2 breaths, I heard my name. Dad. I turned. Nathan stood just beyond the security checkpoint, a deputy at his elbow. His voice was low. You think this makes you some kind of hero? I looked him straight in the eye. No, it makes me a man who's still alive. His lip curled. This isn't over. The deputy pulled him away before I could answer. That night Lopez called. You should know, he said, Harlan filed a motion for mistrial claims. New evidence wasn't disclosed in time. Will it stick? Not with this judge, but it's a scare tactic. They're trying to rattle you before tomorrow. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew they weren't just trying to rattle me. They were trying to see if I'd flinch. The next morning, I put on the same jacket I'd worn to Margaret's funeral. Not out of sentiment, but because it reminded me what real loss feels like. Whatever happened in that courtroom today, I'd already survived worse. When the judge called for closing arguments, the DA's voice was like steel wrapped in velvet. You have heard the testimony. You have seen the evidence. And you have read the words the defendant sent to his accomplice. This was no accident. It was a deliberate act against his father and his father's friend. We ask you to return the only verdict that reflects the truth, guilty. Harlan's closing was colder, almost clinical. He spoke of reasonable doubt, of family rifts, of the dangers of assuming intent. But when the jury left to deliberate, I saw something in their faces. Fatigue maybe, but also certainty. The wait felt longer than the trial itself. Lopez sat with me in the hallway saying little. William dozed in a chair, his cane across his lap. Then the bailiff called us back in. The jury was ready. I watched their foreman stand. He didn't look at Nathan. He looked at the judge. On the charge of attempted murder in the 1st degree, we find the defendant. And in that half second before he finished, I realized I'd been holding my breath since the day that bottle showed up on my porch. Guilty. That one word landed like the first drop of rain on a roof after months of drought. It didn't thunder. It didn't roar. It just sank in quiet, but undeniable. And I knew there was no going back. Not for Nathan, not for me. The courtroom didn't explode in gasps like you see on TV. It just breathed differently, and for the first time in 4 years, I did too. The judge thanked the jury, dismissed them, and began reading the sentence. 25 years in state prison without the possibility of parole for the first 15. Her voice was steady, measured, but I could feel the weight of every syllable pressing down. Nathan didn't flinch. He just sat there, hands cuffed in front of him, eyes fixed on some spot above the judge's head. If I didn't know better, I'd have thought he was bored. The bailiff moved to escort him out, but Nathan turned his head at the last moment. Our eyes met, and in that instant, there was no courtroom, no jury, no uniformed officers, just the boy I'd once taught to throw a baseball staring back at the man he'd tried to kill. His lips barely moved. This isn't the last chapter. Then, he was gone. I thought relief would flood in, but it didn't. What came instead was a hollow ache. Justice had been served on paper, but nothing on paper could glue back the pieces of what had shattered between us. William put a hand on my shoulder as we walked out. You did what you had to do, John. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I nodded, but I didn't answer, because there was a part of me that still wondered if I'd lost more than I'd won. Outside, the air was sharper than it had been that morning. The sky had that late autumn brightness, where the sun feels close, but the wind cuts right through you. William's daughter pulled up in a blue pickup, helped him into the passenger seat, and gave me a small wave. I walked the 2 blocks to my truck alone. No reporters followed me. This wasn't the kind of case that made headlines outside our county, but in our small circle, it would echo for a long time. When I slid behind the wheel, I caught sight of something in the passenger seat. The envelope the court clerk had handed me before we left. Inside was Nathan's property inventory watch belt wallet and a folded note. The handwriting was his. You always said we were more alike than I wanted to admit. Maybe now you'll see that's not a compliment. No signature, just that. I didn't crumple it. I folded it back up, slid it into the glove box, and started the engine. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. No cryptic messages, no unexpected knocks at the door. William recovered faster than the doctors expected, though his appetite for whiskey had evaporated entirely. Mike came by one afternoon with a paper bag. Inside was the small vial of whiskey he'd tested for me. Thought you might want to keep it, he said. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. I put it next to the glass I'd saved, the one William had drunk from that night. Together, they looked almost innocent, like props in a still life painting. But I knew better. 2 months after the verdict, Detective Lopez stopped by on his way home from a fishing trip. He leaned against my porch rail, the late sun catching in his sunglasses. They found out where the poison came from, he said. Wasn't Nathan's idea, at least not originally. My jaw tightened. Who his wife's cousin works in landscaping knows how to extract white snake root. He thought he was doing Nathan a favor, but Nathan's the one who decided to send it to you. It didn't change the facts. It didn't undo anything. But it did confirm what I'd felt in my bones. Nathan hadn't acted in a vacuum. Betrayal has roots, and sometimes they run deeper than blood. That winter, I finally fixed the porch swing, the same swing I'd sat on the morning that the package arrived. The chains didn't creak anymore. The boards didn't splinter. One cold afternoon, I sat there with a cup of black coffee, watching the sun drop behind the bare trees. On the small table beside me was the glass, the vial, and a single manila envelope labeled, "Do not open," in my handwriting. Inside was everything: photos of Nathan as a boy, the court documents, and the note he'd left me. One day, maybe I'd decide whether to keep it or burn it. For now, it stayed sealed. People think revenge ends when the gavel falls, when the guilty are led away. But the truth is, revenge is just the surface. Beneath it are the years you can't get back, the conversations you'll never have, the family dinners that will stay empty chairs and cold plates. Justice gave me safety. It didn't give me peace. But as the wind shifted and carried the smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the road, I realized something: peace isn't given, it's built. One quiet afternoon at a time. One decision not to look back at a locked door. I raised my coffee cup to the empty yard, to endings I said aloud, and whatever comes after. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.